Evan had always been drawn to the unknown. As a child, he would read about mysterious disappearances, cryptic legends, and unsettling urban myths. They were stories that excited him, stories that made him feel alive. But as he grew older, the thrill of the unknown faded, replaced by the demands of adulthood. A steady job, a simple routine. That was all he needed now. Or so he thought. It all started on a dreary evening in November, when a strange envelope appeared on Evan's doorstep. There was no return address, no postage, just his name written in elegant black ink. He picked it up, intrigued. The envelope was thick, heavy, almost as though it contained something weighty. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, its surface glossy and cold to the touch. The words written on it were stark, simple, and chilling. "You have been chosen. The game begins at midnight." Evan's first instinct was to throw it away, dismiss it as a prank or some kind of scam. But something inside him stirred. There was an undeniable feeling of curiosity, a need to understand what the invitation meant. It felt real. Too real to ignore. The note had no further details, just the cryptic message, but Evan felt compelled to follow its instructions. The idea of a game intrigued him, especially one with such ominous undertones. After all, Evan had nothing to lose. His life had become routine, predictable, and utterly devoid of excitement. Maybe this was the thrill he was searching for. At exactly midnight, Evan found himself standing in front of a grand, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of town. He had no idea how he had gotten there. One minute he had been sitting in his living room, staring at the letter in his hands. The next, he was at this imposing structure. The mansion loomed before him, its tall spires reaching into the night sky. The windows were dark, the door ajar, beckoning him inside. The wind howled around the building, sending chills down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, but then something pushed him forward. Perhaps it was the thrill of the unknown, or perhaps it was a deeper, darker part of him, one that longed for the chaos of the unfamiliar. As he stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him with an unnerving finality. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and age. His footsteps echoed through the grand hall, and for a moment, Evan felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seemingly following his every move. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. A chill ran down his spine as he looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. This place felt wrong. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice echoed through the house, deep, rich, and oddly comforting. It sent a wave of unease through Evan's body. "Welcome to the dark game, Evan." Evan's heart skipped a beat. The voice seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him, making him feel as though the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. "You have entered the game. Your challenge begins now. Complete the tasks, survive, and you will win. Fail, and you will become a part of this house, forever." The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Evan was alone, but the voice was everywhere. It wasn't just in his ears, it was inside his head, speaking to him, taunting him. The walls seemed to close in on him, pressing him forward. A door in front of him opened on its own, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, a long table was set with strange items, an assortment of objects that seemed ordinary at first glance, but held an unnerving presence. A candle flickered on the table, casting long shadows across the room. At the center of the table was a large, ornate box. The voice echoed again, this time louder, more urgent. "What more do you want? To begin, you must choose. Open the box and face what lies inside. The first task is simple. You must not flinch. Do not make a sound. Only then will you pass." Evan's throat went dry. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place and never look back. But the strange pull, the irresistible force drawing him toward the box, was too strong. He had come this far. He couldn't back down now. With trembling hands, Evan reached for the box. As his fingers touched it, the temperature in the room dropped and the shadows seemed to grow thicker. He opened the box slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside was a small black object, smooth, cold, and strangely metallic. Before he could examine it further, the room shifted. The walls closed in around him, the ceiling lowering. The temperature plummeted even further, and a low growl emanated from the shadows. He could feel eyes upon him, watching, waiting. The voice spoke again, a mockery of calmness. "Do not move, do not make a sound. If you pass, you will move to the next task. If you fail." The growl became louder, more distinct, as if something massive was creeping toward him, just beyond the veil of the shadows. Evan's heartbeat echoed in his ears. He could feel it. Whatever it was close. He held his breath, not daring to move, the box still clutched in his hand. The growl stopped. The voice, now tinged with something darker, whispered in his ear. He merely nodded his head and pressed his lips together. "You have passed the first task, but this is only the beginning." The mansion shifted again, the hallways stretching endlessly before him, twisting and turning in unnatural angles. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and every step Evan took felt heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the floors creaking under his weight. Cutting through all those years and going relentlessly without seeming to stop. With each new room he entered, the tasks became more dangerous, more surreal. The second task involved a series of locked doors. Each door opened into a different, nightmarish scene, a room full of mirrors, each reflecting Evan in horrifying, distorted ways. A dining room where the plates and silverware floated in mid-air, moving as if controlled by invisible hands, and a dark hallway where Evan could hear the faint sound of children laughing. Only there were no children in sight. The third task was the worst yet. Evan had to cross a bridge that spanned a bottomless chasm. The voice guided him, urging him to keep walking, even as the bridge swayed and creaked beneath his feet. He could feel the darkness below, threatening to consume him, its icy grip tugging at his ankles. With each task, Evan felt himself unraveling. His thoughts became disjointed, his mind clouded with the horrors he was witnessing. He had begun to question what was real and what was part of the game. The house, the tasks, the voice, everything felt like it was closing in on him, and yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't quit. The house seemed to be feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every step he took. Unconsciously, he took one step after another. Evan reached the final room, his body aching, his mind shattered. He was no longer sure what was real or what was part of the game. The voice had grown more insistent, more forceful, its commands echoing through his mind. "You've done well, Evan. You've completed the tasks. Now face your final challenge." In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay a knife, sharp and gleaming in the low light. The voice spoke again. "You're safe here. Pick up the knife, Evan. You have only one choice left. Use it to finish the game. If you do not, you will become one of us, forever trapped here, in this place." Evan's hand shook as he reached for the knife, his mind screaming for him to resist. But there was no resistance left in him. His thoughts were a blur, his body weak. He raised the knife, but as he did, the shadows in the room came alive, swirling around him, pulling at his limbs. They were everywhere, closing in, suffocating him. He shut the lid back down, stepped into the flashlight and squeezed the trigger. "Finish it," the voice demanded. But Evan hesitated. The blade hovered in the air. Was this the right choice? Was this the way out? Or would this be the end? In the next room, upper left hand, the darkness consumed him, and as his thoughts scattered into nothingness, Evan realized that there was no winning the dark game. There was no escape, no final task to complete. The game was never meant to be won. The only thing that mattered was whether or not you could survive long enough to make it to the end. And even then, the house would claim you. Evan's body went limp as the shadows enveloped him. His scream was swallowed by the darkness. The dark game had claimed him. Evan's eyes snapped open, but the world he found himself in was not the one he had left behind. Gone were the haunting corridors of the mansion, the dark tasks, and the voice that had guided him. Instead, he found himself standing in an endless, shifting labyrinth. The walls were made of thick, black mist that curled and writhed around him, constantly changing their shape. The air was heavy with an oppressive weight, like an unseen hand was pressing down on him. He tried to move, but the floor seemed to shift under his feet, making him unsteady. No matter which way he turned, there was no end in sight. The path stretched on and on, disappearing into the mist in all directions. Panic began to creep in, its cold fingers clutching his chest. He wasn't in control anymore. "You cannot escape," a familiar voice echoed through the labyrinth, its tone cold and mocking. It was the voice that had guided him through the game, but now it sounded different. "This is the final stage. The maze will show you your true self, your deepest fears. The question is, how long can you last?" Evan spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing but the thick fog and shadows closing in around him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. No, I didn't sign up for this," he muttered to himself, though he knew deep down that he hadn't had a choice from the beginning. In his defense, he had said that he was just going with the flow, and that it had worked out so far. The labyrinth was alive. It shifted, the walls pulling in closer, narrowing the path until Evan felt as if he were suffocating in its embrace. Each step felt like he was sinking deeper into its grip, and the further he walked, the darker the world became. His surroundings were a blur. Nothing tangible, nothing real, just endless fog and shifting shadows. The floor beneath him rumbled, and before he could react, the ground cracked open, splitting apart like the jaws of some monstrous creature. He fell forward, unable to stop himself, tumbling down a steep incline. He landed hard on the ground below, the wind knocked out of him, but when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the labyrinth. The scene before him was one of disorienting familiarity. A dark, cluttered room, lit only by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. Evan's heart raced as he looked around, recognizing the room as his own apartment. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned, and the air smelled stale, just like when he had been living there. But there was something wrong with it. "Why am I here?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Then, in the reflection of the cracked mirror on the wall, he saw himself, standing perfectly still, looking directly at him. But the Evan in the reflection wasn't the same. His eyes were blackened, hollow, filled with a dark void. His face was gaunt, sickly, twisted. He smiled, a slow, cruel grin that didn't belong to him. "You think you're the one in control?" the twisted reflection asked, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "You're nothing but a pawn in this game. You always have been." The reflection reached out through the glass, its hand passing through the mirror and grabbing Evan's wrist with a grip like iron. He tried to pull away, but the reflection's hand held him fast, and it pulled him toward the mirror, the glass distorting as though it were made of liquid. You will never escape yourself, Evan. The game is not just the house, it's you. You are trapped just like everyone else who has ever played. Evan struggled, panic surging through him. "Let go of me!" he screamed, but the reflection's grip only tightened, its grin growing wider, more sadistic. The world around him began to fade, and he was pulled into the mirror, as if the walls themselves were dissolving into blackness. He was sinking, falling through an endless void of darkness. When Evan opened his eyes again, he found himself standing in an empty, endless white room. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, they were all the same featureless white. It was as though he had been thrust into a blank canvas, stripped of all context, of everything familiar. Evan sat up with a little start and caught his breath. He was too tired to remember what triggered it. "Welcome to the last task, Evan," the voice echoed again, the same voice that had guided him from the very beginning, now colder, sharper. "You have come this far, but it was never about winning. It was never about surviving." Evan stood in the center of the room, feeling more alone than he had ever felt before. He looked around in desperation, trying to make sense of this new environment. But there was nothing here, just endless white space. "The game was never meant for you to win," the voice continued, its tone filled with amusement. "You're not special, Evan. You're just like the others. Another soul to be trapped here." A sharp pain erupted in Evan's chest, and he gasped, stumbling backward. The pain felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside, as though something was ripping into his very essence. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the room around him began to twist and distort. The white room morphed into something darker, something more twisted. Shadows grew from the corners, stretching across the floor, walls, and ceiling. The shadows began to take shape, forming into figures, their faces pale and distorted. They were watching him, silent, cold, hungry. "What do you want from me?" Evan managed to gasp, his voice trembling. There was a reply. The shadows closed in, and the figures reached out toward him, their hands cold and clammy. "We are the ones who lost," a voice whispered from one of the shadows. "We are the ones who failed the game." What? Evan's heart raced as the figures surrounded him. Their hands reached for him, pulling him into their cold embrace. He struggled, but their grip was unyielding. His breath became shallow, his chest tightening as he realized the truth. In part, the dark game had never been about winning. It had been about trapping souls, twisting them, breaking them, until they were nothing more than hollow, empty shells. The final task was not to escape, it was to become one of them. Evan screamed, his voice raw, but the darkness swallowed him whole. The shadows engulfed him, his body sinking into the void, becoming a part of the house, part of the game. The voices of the other souls joined in, whispering, calling out in endless torment. And in the distance he could hear the voice one final time. "Welcome to your new home, Evan. You are ours now."